Good evening. Welcome, everyone. I'm really glad that you all can be here. This is an exciting event and an exciting time. First, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, and we have a pretty long list of it. So I'd like to thank the Ayn Rand Institute, who was instrumental in helping get the speakers here, and we're very appreciative of them. The American Constitution Society for their publicity and for being a great kind of bipartisan support here at Penn Law. I'd like to thank the American Enterprise Institute Executive Council at Penn for their exceptional abilities to get the word out to the undergraduate campus, and the Adam Smith Society for their ability to hop on board to help co-sponsor this and to get the word out to those of you at Wharton. So we're greatly appreciative of all the work that you guys have put in on this. My name is Brent Hansen. I'm the president of the Federalist Society here at Penn, and I'd like to just kind of introduce our speakers and the topic of the event tonight. So this event is kind of important. Recently I was interviewed by the Penn Alumni magazine about kind of a protest that shut down a speech by CIA Director Brennan. And it's kind of come of age that we experience a lot of pushback on freedom of speech and freedom of ideas. So I think that this event is particularly timely. I'd like to introduce our moderator, who will then go ahead and introduce the rest of the speakers. He has told me to keep it short, so I will. Steve Simpson is the Director of Legal Studies at the Ayn Rand Institute. He writes, speaks, and gives interviews for ARI on constitutional law, freedom of speech, campaign finance law, and other legal topics. Without further ado, thank you guys.
Okay, thanks very much, Brent. Let me say thanks to the Federalist Society and all of the other organizations that Brent mentioned for sponsoring this event. It's a very important event on a very important topic. And of course, thanks all to you for coming. And we're live streaming the event, so thanks for everybody who is joining us via live stream. I think this will prove to be a really interesting event. We have great panelists here. So without further ado, let me move to some quick introductions of the panelists. Then we will have some discussion among the panelists on various questions pertaining to the topic. And then after that, we'll go to Q&A, so there'll be plenty of time for audience questions. So to my left is Nadine Strossen. Nadine Strossen is the John Marshall Harlan II Professor of Law at New York Law School. I'm happy to say that she's a former law professor of mine. I attended New York Law School, so this is a double honor and happy for me. Really wonderful opportunity for me to appear with Nadine on this panel. Nadine is the author most recently of Defending Pornography. She's written too many articles to mention here. She was also a former president of the American Civil Liberties Union, and she has spoken and written extensively on the topic of freedom of speech. Secondly is Flemming Rose. Flemming is a former editor of the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten. I'm not sure if I'm even pronouncing that correctly, Flemming, so forgive me. That is, of course, the newspaper that published the Muhammad cartoons in 2005, leading to the now infamous or famous Danish cartoons crisis. Flemming is the author of The Tyranny of Silence, which, by the way, is on sale out front. This is a book that is an account of what happened during the cartoons crisis and the aftermath. He writes and speaks often on freedom of speech and other topics related to that. And we have longer biographies in the program, so everybody should, I encourage you to read those biographies. So join me, please, in thanking both Flemming and Nadine. All right, so what I want to do is I'm going to keep my opening remarks, such as they are, very brief. I really just want to set the context for the discussion, and then we'll continue on to discussing with our panelists this issue of freedom of speech. So the title of the event is Free Speech Under Attack, is the question that we want to evaluate. And let me just start by saying and making what I think is an obvious point, or should be an obvious point, but I don't think it's really as obvious anymore. It's part of the reason that we're having this event, which is that freedom of speech is an absolutely essential right to a free society, and I would argue to the happiness of every member of a free society. And yet we are seeing debates about this right today all across the world, and certainly in the United States, There's an irony in that, even in debating free speech, one must have the right to free speech to call it into question or to debate it. I would ask you all to think about that and think about the implications of that for a free society. Let me say just a few words to set the context and give you a couple examples of the kinds of incidents and debates that have been happening over the last several years. Of course, to start off, I'll start with terrorist attacks by Islamists claiming that, for instance, those who draw pictures of Muhammad are committing blasphemy. The most recent examples being the Charlie Hebdo attack in Paris, an attack in Garland, Texas, and of course the threats and the attacks in connection with the Danish cartoon controversy that Flemming is so familiar with. Not only the attacks, but the aftermath of the attacks, which one might describe as not very promising reaction, to say the least. We'll have more to say about that, and hopefully Flemming will speak to that issue. But one might call a lot of the responses to the attacks as appeasing and hand-wringing and wondering whether we should really continue to protect offensive speech and even hate speech, which of course is a big debate these days. Secondly, the atmosphere on college campuses today, I'll just very quickly describe it as students constantly or often demanding trigger warnings, safe spaces, and complaining about microaggressions as though they are concerned about being confronted with controversial ideas. There are an increasing number of intellectuals and opinion leaders in the United States and elsewhere who are calling into question the right to offend others. And we've seen the rise of hate speech laws and other types of laws in Europe. And again, I hope that both Flemming and Nadine will speak to that. But these are laws that actually outlaw what is otherwise what's known as hate speech and speech that offends others. So that raises the question, what's going on and what should we do with it, do about it? So I want to start by asking my co-panelists here that question. I mean, the title of the event is Free Speech Under Attack? So let me start with that. Do you believe that free speech is under attack? Maybe what's happening is just a coincidence. I'd love to hear from both of you. Perhaps we can start with Nadine, if you don't mind.
Free speech is, well, first of all, thank everybody for being here. I really, really appreciate it. We can't have free speech without understanding, and you're here at least for the understanding, so that's already support of free speech. Yes, it is under attack now, but that has always been the case. I have been on the free speech hustings for many, many decades, and the only thing that changes, and even that doesn't change too much, is exactly what speech is so controversial, seen as being so dangerous, that we cannot afford the luxury of the potential harm, letting speech thrive because of the potential harm that it threatens. And the reason why I say even the content of speech that is seen as dangerous has not really changed that much. In the United States, sex is always enemy number one, right? As a humorist in my own home state of Minnesota put it this way when he was testifying, a couple of decades ago, something called the National Endowment for the Arts was under attack because it had funded some artworks that were exploring themes of female sexuality from a feminist perspective, were exploring themes of LGBT sexuality, and this was so controversial that Congress was going to pull the plug on all of the funding. So this humorist was testifying about how in America we had, with our puritanical heritage, we were always seeing speech about sex as being uniquely dangerous. And he said, you know, my ancestors were Puritans who came here in 1648 in the hope of finding more repression than existed in the old country. And I understand that yet again the new Attorney General is committed to going after sexually explicit speech. So that's always a suspect target in this country. And then hate speech, the perennial debate. When I was in law school, a famous controversial case took place that many of you will have heard of. It kind of epitomizes American defense of freedom, even for the speech that we hate. And that was the famous Skokie controversy in the neo-Nazi party wanted to have a demonstration in Skokie, Illinois, a town that had not only a large Jewish population, many of whom were Holocaust survivors. And the ACLU, the organization that I was proud to head for many years, undertook the defense of free speech rights of the Nazis in Skokie. It was a slam dunk winner under long-established principles of First Amendment law. But it was so controversial publicly that even the ACLU, an organization of die-hard free speech supporters, we lost 15% of our membership at the time. And everybody, you know, and one of my friends said, you know, everybody has his or her Skokie. We all support free speech, and I've debated every censor in the world, and they all say, I'm against censorship. I support free speech, but, and the but is, as my friend said, we all have one message that we think is so uniquely dangerous that it has to be suppressed. And the other example, of course, is violence or terrorism. So over and over and over again, people who generally support free speech are willing to censor it, to make an exception based on some content that they hate or they believe, again, to quote Oliver Wendell Holmes, to be fraught with death. So these are it's as important now as it ever has been, but it's not more important than it's been in the past.
Good. Funny?
Yeah, yes, free speech under attack, and I agree with Nadine that it's nothing new. That has been the case all throughout history. Of course, we are still living in relatively good times compared to the beginning of the 20th century or mid-20th century, but we are living in worse times than, I would say, 10, 15, 20 years ago. So things are getting worse. And there's always been a battle for free speech or against free speech, but I would say that the context for the debate we are having today is a little bit, it's different. And it's different, I would say, in two ways. The world we're living in today and the debate about free speech is going on in a new situation that is driven by two new factors. The one is the digital technology. The fact that what is being published somewhere is immediately being published everywhere. What is being published by a relatively small newspaper in Denmark in a language that only 5 million people can read can be read in countries 5,000-10,000 kilometers away, and not only read, but people can react to it politically and make demands on the limits of free speech in other countries, because thanks to digital technology it also becomes part of their reality. And the digital technology is wonderful in most ways, but it creates a lot of space for manipulation and misunderstandings and distortion. And the cartoon crisis is in fact a case in point. If you really want to understand what globalization has done to that debate, I think my book is a case study in the way globalization works and can run counter to the principles of free speech. So we have this global digital space, but at the same time we still have national boundaries and laws operating within countries and cultures. So the one thing is this digital technology that makes the context to free speech different. The other factor is migration. The fact that people are moving across borders in numbers and at a speed never seen before in the history of mankind. We have had migration before, but not at the speed and in numbers we are experiencing today. And it means that most societies in the world are getting more and more diverse when it comes to culture, ethnicity, and religion. So the question becomes, how do we manage a growing diversity of information, a growing diversity of culture, ethnicity, and religion, and at the same time safeguard fundamental principles like freedom of expression and freedom of speech. And basically, today there are two approaches to this new situation. One approach is to say, if you respect my taboo, I respect yours. If it's a criminal offense, or if you refrain from publishing cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, I will also refrain from denying the Holocaust or mocking Jesus Christ or Buddha or Shiva goddesses within Hinduism, and so on and so forth. And that sounds on the surface maybe nice. Most decent people, they don't like to offend other people on the basis of their religion or ethnicity or culture. But the fact of the matter is that in a diverse world where we believe in different things, when we adhere to different religions and different gods, and we have different cultural backgrounds, one man's hate speech is another man's poetry. What is blasphemy to a Christian will be sacred to a Muslim, and vice versa. And therefore this, on the surface, nice principle that if you respect my taboo, I respect yours, will lead to a tyranny of silence, I believe. In the end, you will not be able to say anything that may not be perceived as offensive to somebody, and therefore you will have a right to shut that voice down if you follow that principle. The other way to go is to ask yourself, what are the minimal limitations on speech that we need in order to be able to live in peace in this increasingly diverse world in terms of culture, ethnicity, and religion. And to me, the key limitation on speech should be incitement to violence. Apart from that, I think I can live with a very narrowly defined libel law, and I also think that people have a right to privacy, that the media shouldn't have a right to invade. But it means that that in a world that is growing increasingly more and more diverse, we will have to accept that we may be offended by what other people say from time to time. And therefore, for me, the key battle about freedom of speech today is about tolerance. Unfortunately, tolerance is one of the most distorted and misunderstood concepts in today's world. Even UNESCO, the UN organization promoting culture, defines toleration as the need to suppress critical and offensive speech. That's not what toleration originally meant. To me, tolerance means a judicial and political frame where you have to live with things that you hate, things that you actively dislike, and because you're tolerant, you do not ban them, and you do not use violence, intimidation, and threats to shut them down. That is the key the key notion of tolerance. So in order to promote free speech, we have to re-educate ourselves about what tolerance mean.
I'd like to add something, since we're in a law school, that freedom of speech for really the past several decades in this country has been very, very secure as a matter of law. And what's really extraordinary is for a United States Supreme Court that is so deeply divided on so many constitutional law issues, on so many civil liberties issues. This is a court that all across the ideological spectrum, by and large, has been extremely supportive of freedom of speech, all of the most controversial examples that we've cited. I mean, there are a few exceptions. We don't have a perfect record in the Supreme Court, but when you look at the course of history and around the world, it's extraordinary. And so I felt it important to say that, because I agree with Flemming that the biggest threat is not, in this country, is not coming from government officials seeking to suppress speech. Yes, there are some of those, but I think the bigger threat by far is from a public that is supine at best and hostile at worst.
Yeah, that's
And
sorry,
just
go
one,
ahead.
and I think it has to do with the fact that I think most of us strive to be free. You know, we like to have the right to do what and say whatever we want. That's not the difficult part. But tolerance is not, you know, something innate human. It is really something that you have to teach and learn and acquire, and in many ways it goes against human nature, because you want to shut down things that you don't like. It makes you feel uncomfortable, so it takes an effort to be tolerant. And because the concept of tolerance has been turned on its head, tolerance today means that yes, I know you maybe have a right to say what you want, but I think you should shut up. That is what tolerance is to most people today. But it's exactly the opposite as the way it came into the world after the wars of religion in Europe in the 16th and 17th century, where it meant the right of people belonging to another religion to exercise their religion in spite of the fact that the dominant religion perceived this faith as blasphemy and in fact as a threat to the political, social and economic order of the day.
So free speech but attitude. I support free speech, but you're not allowed to offend someone else's fill in the blank. I want to follow up on something that Nadine raised, and really both things that both of you raised, but you just made a point that I've been thinking about a lot and made in the past, which is we have a robust First Amendment jurisprudence, and one might look at that and say, what's the big deal? I mean, the Supreme Court will save us, so to speak. The First Amendment will save us. And I agree with you that if attitudes change, the courts will ultimately follow in the interpretation of the Constitution, will follow public attitudes. But I'd like you to expand on that a little bit. You're a professor, you interact with students constantly, you interact with other intellectuals. So part of what I want to ask you both, can you expand on the point a little bit, but also have attitudes changed in recent years in your view, either among students or intellectuals? One way you might think about it is, I mean, to be cliched about it, young people are our future, right? And if their attitudes change, we're going to lose our rights. Speak to that a bit.
Yeah, there have been a lot of disconcerting, troubling public opinion surveys which show that support for what is a fundamental cornerstone of freedom of speech jurisprudence, accepted by every contemporary and modern Supreme Court justice, namely what is often called viewpoint neutrality. That government may never suppress speech merely because the viewpoint, the idea that it expresses is disliked, even if it's disliked by the vast majority of the public or the vast majority of officials, even if it's reviled. that alone is not enough of a justification to suppress it. You have to show some, one example being the one that Flemming gave, an intentional incitement to imminent violence, and the only way to prevent the violence is by shutting down the speech. But that principle, widely accepted as it is by justices and lawyers, I think, is really falling into disfavor among members of the public. And I say this not just anecdotally, but based on public opinion surveys. And sadly, the younger the age group, the less support there is for that principle. To the extent that some of the surveys I've seen by Pew and by other reputable organizations show that something like a majority, it's not a large majority, but it's more than half of college students believe that there should not be a right to say something that is offensive. And I agree with Flemming, and I've seen countless examples in my travels that everything is offensive to somebody, right? You know, thank goodness for our diversity, which is diversity of beliefs as well. And on some college campuses, even defending freedom of speech has been attacked as offensive, right? And we certainly saw it during the political campaigns. People were constantly trading attacks, or during the presidential campaigns, constantly trading accusations of being offensive and hateful. So it is not enough to just rest on the Supreme Court. I fully agree with an early free speech scholar in the 20th century named Zechariah Chafee. He wrote one of the very first books defending freedom of speech. He was a founder of the ACLU, a professor at Harvard Law School, and he said, in the end, people will have just as much freedom of speech as they want, right? Because in the end, we are sovereign, and we can elect officials who can nominate Supreme Court justices, who can roll the clock back to the days when, until the second half of the 20th century, the Supreme Court enforced something called the bad tendency test. You know, if we had reason to fear that speech might lead to a bad idea, which might motivate somebody, somewhere, somehow, to take some bad action, that was enough of a justification for censorship. And that's why Eugene Debs, a Socialist Party candidate for president, who got more votes than Ralph Nader did, percentage-wise, you know, was imprisoned for merely criticizing the draft. That's why Margaret Sanger, the founding mother of Planned Parenthood, was imprisoned multiple times for giving women basic information about their bodies. And I could give you countless other examples. So that's why I'm so grateful to all of you, because you ultimately have at least as much power as the Supreme Court to make sure that free speech lives as a reality.
Did you want to follow up on that? I can continue and ask questions if you want.
Yeah. In fact, it seems that Nadine will agree, even though I felt a little bit uneasy in the company of two law professors or lawyers to say that one shouldn't put too much confidence into the law. And right now in Europe, there is a tendency to pass new laws every time the public is facing a new problem. I think that we need laws, but laws do not change reality. And when it comes to free speech, and if you take the United States of America, you could say that yes, the law due to the Supreme Court defends and protects almost any speech. But the social pressures on free speech in the United States are far stronger than in Europe, where you have legally many more limitations on speech. I mean, I can say things in Europe and not being prosecuted, but if I say them at a workplace on a radio station in the United States, I will lose my job and get socially marginalized. So the law isn't everything. It's really what Robert Post, a famous First Amendment scholar in the United States, in fact, put forward the proposition that hate speech laws are not about fighting hate, but it's about enforcing social norms of the majority in a community. And I think these are, in fact, these social norms about what can be said and what cannot be said are maybe the most effective limitation on free speech in any society.
Flemming, can you give some examples? So you're familiar with European hate speech laws, and I don't know how many Americans really understand these laws.
I've been taken to court myself, in fact.
Yeah, so give us some examples of what this looks like in practice and the kinds of things that have been prosecuted in Europe.
Well, I mean, how many hours do we have? Yeah, all European countries, they have hate speech laws, laws criminalizing incitement to hate based on religion, ethnicity, sex, physical disabilities, and so on and so forth. And they are all based in the UN Convention on Political and Civil Rights that was passed in the 60s, in fact obligating every country signing the convention to pass these kinds of laws. The United States didn't sign the convention, and therefore you don't have hate speech laws in the United States, but in every other country in the world and also in Europe, you do have these laws. And as I said, I believe there is a case to be made that this is not about fighting hate. It's about enforcing upon society, imposing upon society one group's social norms. And that becomes very problematic if society gets more diverse.
I want to say something that I hope would go without saying, but I and the ACLU are as fully committed to ending discrimination and promoting civility and diversity and inclusion and equality of opportunity, and as we are to freedom of speech. And one of the reasons why I so passionately defend freedom of speech is, to me, it demonstrably is the most essential prerequisite for any movement for equal rights. And one of the interesting things about the United States is that, and conversely, censorship, including of what's considered offensive speech or hate speech, has been the single most potent weapon for suppressing every movement for equality, starting with the abolitionist movement and the movement for women's suffrage and the reproductive freedom movement and the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century, the gay rights movement, you name it. And the leaders of those movements in this country all have opposed censorship of hate speech and offensive speech because those were the laws that were used to suppress their speech. It's really hard for us to imagine now, but in the 1960s, Martin Luther King's speech and speech by civil rights demonstrators was considered hate speech. It was considered insurrectionary. It was considered terroristic because it was threatening the most deeply cherished values of communities and their way of life. So one of the other reasons why I don't like laws that, we shouldn't focus so much on laws is that, Mark Twain, I think, said, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then all problems look like nails. So it is law professors mostly that have come up with these theories that, well, we want to improve equality, we want to end discrimination on campus, so let's pass a law, let's make it illegal, but it's a diversion from the more constructive, meaningful steps, such as laws that criminalize discrimination, which the United States has enforced much more vigorously. And European countries, many of them are engaging in the symbolism of punishing the expression, but not the discriminatory conduct.
Well, just to follow up on Europe, when I wrote The Tyranny of Silence about the cartoon crisis back in 2006, and when I traveled around the world and debated this issue, I was quite often confronted with accusations of demonizing Muslims the same way that Jews had been demonized in Europe in the 20s, 30s, leading all the way to the Holocaust. And therefore I sat down and studied the Weimar Republic in Germany, and I found out that there were hate speech laws on the books in Weimar Germany, and leading Nazi officials were in fact convicted for hate speech. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda to Hitler, lost several cases against the Vice Police Director of Berlin, Bernhard Weiss, who was Jewish. And if you take Julius Streicher, the executive editor Der Stürmer, a Nazi magazine, he went to jail twice because of anti-Jewish content, and his magazine was confiscated, taken to court, I think 36 times during 10 years, from 1923 until 1933. And talking about the Holocaust, I found out that most European countries today, they have laws criminalizing Holocaust denial. And to my great surprise, I found out that these laws were passed exclusively after the fall of the Berlin Wall. I would have expected that they had been passed in the 50s or in the 60s, quite close to the Holocaust, in order to prevent a repetition, but it turned out that they were only passed after the reunification of Europe in 1989, 1991. And I think any democracy or any society should be very careful legislating about historical truth, no matter how offensive Holocaust denial is. And it has triggered a sequence of other laws in Europe today. So in Eastern Europe, where they don't see the Holocaust as a defining event to their tragic history, but communist regimes, they have passed laws criminalizing denial of the crimes of communism. And in some European countries, Switzerland and France, it's a criminal offense to deny the Armenian genocide. And those laws has in fact been replicated in other parts of the world, less liberal than Western Europe. In Bangladesh, they have passed a law criminalizing denial of the fact that 3 million people were killed during the Civil War in the 70s, early 70s. And 3 million killed is in fact a fake number. It was taken from an article in a Soviet newspaper at the time, while serious historians today believe that between 125 and 500,000 people were killed. But if you publish that more accurate figure in a historical article, you can go to jail in Bangladesh. The same in Rwanda today, where it's a criminal offense to promote genocidal ideology. And it includes, in fact, laughing at other people in order to take them down. So these laws are being used to silence speech that you don't like. And in Europe today, where we have a lot of migration from the Muslim world, it's a big challenge because the biggest group in Europe of Holocaust deniers today are Muslims. They come from countries where they have been taught that the Holocaust was a fiction, invented by the Jews, and they come to Europe and they are not able to air their stupid, outrageous and offensive opinions, and therefore we are unable to counter them in schools, in public debates and things like that. And I have not seen in history any example of an individual that has changed his mind or opinion just because it has been criminalized and banned. Quite to the contrary.
Let me ask a question that I think is implicit throughout this entire discussion, and we're running up against the time where we have to get to questions. So I want to pose this as kind of the last question. We take for granted, I said, I think earlier in my remarks, if I didn't, I should have, Americans take free speech for granted. I think all free people do. They have a tendency to overlook the value of it. And which raises the question of why do we protect free speech? It's something that we ought to be able to articulate and put out there and make clear why it is not just a right, but a value, or maybe you don't agree with that, but that's the question I'd like to pose to the panelists as the final question, and then we can move to the Q&A session. So Nadine, why don't we start with you?
Philosophers have, and political scientists have been talking about this forever. I'll just talk based on my own experience. First of all, I alluded to, for me, as an advocate of human rights and civil liberties, free speech is absolutely the prerequisite. If we can't speak out, if we can't protest, if we can't associate with the other like-minded individuals, if we can't demonstrate, if we can't petition the government for redress of grievances, then we're not going to have any movements for any other cause at all, including human rights, including the environment, whatever your cause is. Religion, freedom of speech is the prerequisite. I have also experienced something that I've read in Supreme Court opinions, which is that freedom of speech is the beginning of thought itself. Anthony Kennedy, a great free speech defender on the court, said that, and it seemed to me at first I thought, well, it's the other way around, isn't it? Don't you think and then you speak? But it's actually an iterative process for all of us who try to put our thoughts in writing. The process of writing helps us to crystallize our thoughts. The process of debating and testing our ideas in the cauldron and crucible of having other people disagree with us is essential for our own development of our own thoughts, for our sense of self-expression. Justice John Marshall Harlan, after whom I'm happy to occupy a chair, as Steve mentioned, interestingly enough, a conservative member of the Supreme Court strongly defended in a case in which he upheld the right of a Vietnam-era protester at a time when the F word, I tell you, was as offensive then as the N-word is now. It's the only comparison I can make. He was begged by other Supreme Court justices not to put that word in the opinion. It was seen as being so dangerous. So number one, a very offensive word in the context of the time. Number two, a very offensive idea, the draft, which was then very popular, and he said that that you could not, as the government was arguing, force this young man, a draft protester, to voice his idea with a somewhat different word. Can't you use something that's just not quite so offensive, not quite so insulting? And this, dignified, gentlemanly Wall Street lawyer conservative, John Marshall Harlan, said, there is something, first of all, you cannot change a word without changing the idea. It is precisely the shock value that this young man, Paul Cohen, is trying to convey. Secondly, that freedom of speech, because people were saying, including some of the dissenting justices, well, that's not an idea, it's emotional, it's anger. And he said, freedom of speech has to do with ineffable emotions and self-expression, and not just, reasoned persuasion. So there's an autonomy value to it as well. So those are the individual values at stake. From a society perspective, in a democratic republic where we, the people, to quote the opening words of our Constitution, are sovereign, we cannot be self-governing unless we have freedom to criticize and dissent from those we elect to carry out the policies we support. We cannot have our, we the people will lose our popular sovereignty unless we have freedom of speech.
Great. I agree with everything Nadine said. So I won't repeat it, but I would add two more reasons for the need to defend free speech. And the one is that free speech is important to defend the weak. If you look at history, movements for women's rights, the civil rights movement, the workers' movement, the rights for ethnic, religious minorities, they have always been dependent on the right to speak out. And the powers to be in any society have in fact used hate speech laws to clamp down on these movements for rights. So, and today we tend to understand it the other way around, that we need hate speech laws to protect the weak. But it just takes another political majority to use those laws against the weak. This is, for instance, going on in the Netherlands today. There is a populist politician by the name Geert Wilders, who recently was convicted for hate speech. And the irony is that if he becomes prime minister and if he gets a majority in Dutch parliament, he will use exactly the same law to criminalize the Quran and shut down mosques and things like that. So free speech is very important for movements that want social and political change. The other reason is more existential. Several years ago, I interviewed Salman Rushdie, the author of the Satanic Verses, who had to live with a fatwa for many years and in hiding. And I interviewed him, I think, in 2008 and 2009, or through 2009. And he said something that it rang a bell. He said, what makes human beings different from animals is the fact that we are storytelling animals. We have language. Animals that do not have a capacity to express themselves and a mind in the same way as human beings do. And we live through storytelling. We express ourselves through language and stories in order to understand ourselves, in order to express ourselves, in order to convince others and listening to others and so on and so forth. And therefore, according to Rushdie, if you violate the right to tell a story in exactly the way you want, you are not only committing a political crime, but you are committing a crime against human nature. So it's also an existential question about what it means to be a human being, to have the right to tell stories and phrase things in exactly the way you want, as long as you do not incite violence in an immediate way with a clear and present danger.
Thanks. We can turn to questions now, and I would invite people to start making their way to the microphone. I'm going to say a few things in connection with what Nadine and Flemming did as people are gathering. Just to add my 2 cents to that, I agree with most, if not all, of what was said, and I want to pick up on a couple themes. Flemming made the point, and I love this way to put it, that attack on free speech is an attack on human nature. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, individuals, and the way I would put it is that we distinguish ourselves, or humans are distinguished by the fact that we think and we reason, and we have to do that to live our lives and be who we are. So the three themes I would emphasize are reason, individualism, and freedom. We have to be free to live as individuals, to think and chart our own course in life. It's impossible to force another person to agree with you. I think Flemming made that point earlier. You can destroy him, you can stop him from thinking and functioning, but you cannot make him think the way you want. Any effort to try to prevent people from thinking or expressing themselves, which is the corollary to thinking, can only lead to destruction, not only of the individuals, but ultimately of the society. So thanks very much for both of you. Okay, let's start over here, and we'll try to get through. I want to just say before you start, try to keep the questions to a minimum, a couple sentences. One might say 140 characters in today's social media world. Please don't use the opportunity to lecture people. Questions would be better, I think, and we'll definitely pick up on where you're going. So we can start here.
Okay, I'll try to keep it short. So, sorry, I'm not a lawyer, I'm an engineer. Just going to lead off with that, just because of what my question is. And my concern with the nature of free speech and maintaining free speech is that people like me who work in the IT and the computer space, making it so like nobody's really anonymous anymore. Where do you think the right to free speech, which at least in my mind, seems to be tied to anonymity and the ability to say something without everybody in the world immediately know that it's you saying it, where do you go if nothing is truly private anymore, nothing is truly anonymous anymore? How can speech be free if everybody can singularly target you for saying a certain thing at whatever time?
Good question. Who wants to start? Nadine?
Well, the Supreme Court agrees with you, Mr. Engineer, that an essential aspect of freedom of speech is the freedom to speak anonymously. And I'm disappointed in what you say for exactly the reasons that you cite. The Federalist Papers were pseudonymous, and they're even in a recent case involving handing out political leaflets. The Supreme Court has defended the right to anonymity precisely because you might be deterred from speaking in the first place unless you had that privacy. I'm disappointed in what you suggest, that technologically anonymity is no longer possible. I didn't understand that. I thought there were ways to speak anonymously online, and so we'll depend on you to make sure that that continues using your expertise.
Like the technical discussion, I didn't want to bother before everybody left.
No, I don't think. I mean, on anonymity, I have nothing to add, but on privacy, yes. I think there is a close connection between the right to privacy and free speech. And if you have lived in a dictatorship like I have in the Soviet Union, you understand why. If you feel that you are surveilled, and if you feel that if you know that people are listening to what you are saying, you are less free, and there are things that you will not say, even in your own home. You will go out into the woods and talk. So privacy, the right to privacy, is a very important component to free speach.
And I should say, when the NSA surveillance came to light, thanks to Edward Snowden exercising his free speech rights on behalf of all of us, the ACLU challenged that surveillance as violating not only the Fourth Amendment right to privacy, but the First Amendment right to free speech and free association and freedom of religion.
A couple quick points. One, I slightly disagree with you on the Supreme Court on anonymity, only to say that I don't think they've done as good a job as they could. They've enforced, they've allowed states and governments to force political speakers to disclose who they are when they speak in political context, which I think is a bad precedent. But the only other thing I'll point out is to be careful to make a distinction between government forcing people to disclose themselves when they speak or invading their privacy. one could say violating their property rights by requiring them to produce information that they don't want to produce. And I think the Snowden example is a good one in all of what is wrapped up in that. But it's not, I mean, we do have to make a distinction between that and what is publicly available information. And I don't know, Flemming, if you want to speak to the issue of the right to, the right to
Be forgotten.
In what's going on in Europe. But I think this is a very problematic issue of the government essentially saying we're going to erase actual facts from existence just because people are opposed to having them continue to be public. But if you want to...
But it goes to the heart at the philosophical difference between the US and Europe when it comes to speech. In the United States, freedom of speech or the First Amendment cannot be balanced against other rights. There may be limitations on speech, but you cannot balance the First Amendment against other rights. In all European countries, you can do that, and you can say, well, yes, free speech, but to serve democracy or to make the nation safe or to preserve dignity, you can limit freedom of expression. And I think it's the same with the right to be forgotten, where you prioritize something else than freedom of expression. The newspaper I used to work at were forced to remove an article about a manager who had lied about his CV, that he had an education that he in fact didn't have, and he were citing working experience that he didn't have. And after a few years, the newspaper was forced to remove these stories after the person in question appealed to Google and said he would like to have erased that information. So individuals have a right to change history, to rewrite history, which I find very problematic. But I would say on anonymity as a former editor, and this is just to pose a question maybe to you. In Europe, newspapers try to regulate the debate on their website, which sometimes totally goes off track. And when they ask people, or when they only let people have access to the commentary, if they identify themselves, it tends to have a disciplinary effect on the debate, and it improves the quality of the debate, so people cannot hide behind anonymity, where they feel free to say more insulting things than if they speak in their own name. So how should we manage that challenge?
My answer would be it's up to private parties to regulate or decide how they want to conduct their own debates. And I agree wholeheartedly that, I mean, that's my experience. Comments on my articles tend toward the insane at times, and it's often because they're anonymous. But I don't think the government has any right to compel someone to disclose. And the way I would think about it is, it's a piece of information that you get to control. It's just as much within your control and within your right as any other thing you could say in your book or your article, etc. Let's keep going with questions. So over here.
Hello. Flemming had said near the beginning that tolerance is something that needs to be taught and learned. Could you expand on how that could potentially be done? Because I definitely know I have felt when I've read something on the internet that maybe I strongly disagree with, emotionally I did feel as if it was a personal attack, even though obviously it was not. So how do you teach somebody that in this world where you can read all these different opinions that these are not personal attacks, these people are not rude, how do you teach them to tolerate something that makes them feel bad or hurt?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question, and we have to think about that and work out ways to make that possible. But I think we have to, what is going on right now is that quite and teachers around the world, they quite often try to avoid exposing their children or their students to things that make them feel uncomfortable. So I think we have to teach young people that in order to grow as individuals and to understand what it feels to be somebody who disagrees with you, that it's very important that we create a space where it is okay to say things that other people may find offensive and talk about it. What is going on now is that we just try to keep silent. And I think the social media is reinforcing this trend because Facebook is built on an algorithm that provides you stuff that makes you feel comfortable and things with which you agree. It's only if you yourself make an effort to like and share things with which you disagree that your newsfeed will get these things.
It absolutely can be taught. I think we're unfortunately going in the opposite direction. We're teaching people to be more thin-skinned and more sensitive. And I think it's wonderful for all of us to be empathetic and to be, sensitive to avoiding, as Flemming said, none of us wants to offend somebody else. But we also have to be thick-skinned when people are criticizing us. And believe me, I've had to learn it. I hate to shock you, but I've been subject to a lot of ugly criticism for a lot of reasons, and I just could not have survived if I were not able to, have a philosophical attitude toward it. So, and I know that psychologists and educators have developed curricula along those lines. It's a great question.
A couple of very quick comments. One is picking up on something that both Nadine and Flemming said, is that confronting other people's ideas, even crazy ideas, is part of learning. And when you figure out that you really need to grapple with other people's ideas, bad ideas, figure out why they're bad, it becomes a lot easier to deal with harsh commentary and all kinds of criticisms. Another, and this is a vast oversimplification, so I just want to bookmark the point, but it is definitely true, which is ultimately reason and truth do prevail. And I'll give you one piece, so that it sounds crazy in the society where we see all of the nonsense that we see. Look, we just inaugurated a president who, seems to have a real truth problem, right? So it seems odd that someone would say this, but think about it like this. We wouldn't be where we are in history, in the amazing society, the amazing free and modern society in which we live, if ultimately reason and truth didn't prevail in the long run. So that's a conviction that I hold, thinking, okay, I can win if I have truth and reason on my side, and I think that makes it a lot easier to deal with bad ideas. Okay, next one.
Well, I want to thank you first of all, but that leads directly into my question, because I have to take issue with this sort of teleological view that truth and reason necessarily prevail, given, I think, exactly where we are. And I would ask, what do you have to say less on the issue of offensive speech and more on the issue of fake speech, fake news, the ability of a tyrannical government on the other side of the world to manipulate election by using misinformation, and for civil society to actually gaslight other members of its own civil society in order to propagate false information, which has the ability to undermine our democracy. How do we grapple with that? Because I know that lies are nothing new, but certainly in the age of information that we live in, lies being more predominant than truth has the potential to severely undermine democratic processes. So I just wanted you to maybe address that.
I think there's absolutely no doubt that this is one of the real risks of free speech, and no defender of free speech has ever denied the potential danger. Again, going back to the classic Supreme Court opinions by Oliver Wendell Holmes, he said, it's risky, it's dangerous, but the question is, as opposed to what? And as a civil libertarian, I would far rather put my trust in free speech ultimately to prevail. It might take a long time, rather than to trust the government to take these decisions away from us. Can you imagine empowering any government, including the one that we have now, with the power to decide what is fake news and what is real news? So for me, the question is, whom do you distrust less? And yes, it's true that the internet, as a great communications medium, has great capacity to spread lies, but it also has great capacity to correct the lies. I've actually been doing a lot of reading recently. There's some attempt now to empirically study counter speech and how it is facilitated on the internet. And you can create links to the actual facts. You have PolitiFact. You have a lot of opportunity for those of us who seek it out. And we have to really educate, just as we have to educate in tolerance, we have to educate in media literacy and critical analysis. I heard on the radio this morning, I think, that University of Washington is starting a new course called BS. And it's about educating students to figure out what is BS and what is not. And I'd rather have people do that themselves than have Big Brother come in and try to do it for us, or to us.
Yeah. As you said yourself, fake news is nothing new. It used to be called false information. But in order to give the sense that this is really something new that we have to fight probably with the law, we invent this new concept. I think in many ways, I mean, don't get me wrong, I believe that false information and the spreading of false information is a problem. I think we can in many ways thank ourselves for that development, because we have not, the media, in academia, there's been this tendency to underestimate, the value of truth. A lot of people, well, there is no such thing as the truth. No values are better than others. So we're creating an environment where it's okay to, you can look at things in different ways, and what is the truth? In Europe right now, there are serious political forces calling for criminalization of fake news. First question, who's to decide what fake news is? And you can see from the proposals coming from the Social Democrats and the CDU in Germany, that's a government party, a minister in Italy, politicians in Denmark, that they will use the fake news concept to shut down their opponents. And they explicitly say, well, we have to criminalize fake news in order to fight populism, because they are the ones who benefit from fake news. The fact of the matter is that the populists, the reason why fake news is spreading, that is uncontrolled, information, is because populist movements and people supporting them, they believe that the mainstream media is putting out fake news. It may not be fake news, but they believe they're not telling the whole truth about, for instance, the problems with immigration in Europe. You are hiding things from us. It may be true, in a superficial sense, but on a deeper level, you are not telling us statistics are not being published. When crimes are being committed, you're not saying who is committing them, and so on and so forth. So and the German minister, in fact, explicitly proposed equalizing fake news to hate speech. So it should be possible to put people in prison for 5 years in a liberal democracy like Germany for fake news. I happen to live in the Soviet Union, and in the penal code of the Soviet Union, you had 2 articles criminalizing dissemination of false information undermining the Soviet political and social systems. And exactly those two articles were being used to put dissidents in labor camps for many years or exiling them. So I think this is a very, very slippery and dangerous path if you start criminalizing fake news. There is no other way than to counter it with truthful information.
Yeah, if Donald Trump isn't the best argument against giving government the power to regulate fake news, then I don't know what would be. Although I would have said the same thing if his opponent had won. But the only solution to falsity or fake news or fake whatever is to give people the freedom to use their minds and debate with people and discuss and investigate and reach the truth on their own. There's no substitute for that. In fact, I think the only thing that can really create a kind of orthodoxy in a society is censorship. And if you look through history, you'll see that the societies that have had widespread false views on things or dissemination of false information, it's been societies that have had censorship. By the way, I think you might have been alluding to this. The New York Times has done some really interesting reporting on the issue of fake news, pushing back against the idea that it's a problem, which is both, it's very good reporting. It's kind of ironic given that Trump attacks the New York Times as one of the worst of the mainstream media, and I think it's worth pondering that, but I'll leave it at that. It's a good question, though, so I think we're over here. Oh, sorry, Brent, do you have
Right, I have something.
some live stream questions? Great.
Okay, so one question that came up was the idea about shutting down like campus speakers, right? So people show up to campus, usually they are conservatives, and then their ideas get shut down, they get laughed out of either they show up and they get protested out, or they're uninvited to begin with. I was wondering if you guys could talk about that.
That is obviously a violation of freedom of speech, which includes not only the right of speakers to speak, but to willing audience members voluntarily to hear the speaker. And so it's a double violation. Believe me, I completely defend the right to protest, to dissent, to disagree with the speaker, but not in a way that prevents the speaker from communicating to a willing audience.
Can I ask? I want to ask a follow-up question to that because there is. I agree with your point, Nadine, but I'm at the same time sympathetic to the university administrator who has to decide how do we educate students and also have a university that is sort of like a constant protest zone, and those two things don't seem like they can go together. So, do either of you have views of how would a university administrator deal with these sort of, we could call them competing values in a sense, in a university environment? Is it the case that they should just allow students to speak whenever they want? Is there what's the right approach to that?
Well, so a very important tenet of First Amendment law is that government has a lot more latitude, government including public universities, to impose content-neutral time, place, and manner regulations. So here in this forum to discuss this particular topic, I would not defend somebody's free speech rights to talk about another topic or to shout in a way that disrupted these proceedings. But I assume that what we're talking about are speakers who are being invited to some forum, and you know, if you're talking about the classroom, then I think the professor has a professional responsibility to be selective in only inviting guest speakers to class who have academic bona fides and, you know, not just to present any crackpot theory. So the precise place on a campus is important.
Okay, I think we're over here. Is that right?
Yes.
Go.
Thank you. The past 2 summers, I've traveled to Rwanda, and during my visit there, I went to the Genocide Memorial Museum. And at the end of learning about the 1994 Rwanda genocide, there's a room dedicated to other genocides that happened throughout history and across the globe, some of which are not recognized by the United States government. And that room to me reads a lot like a textbook on how to perform a genocide, because there's just a very clear pattern in every single one of them. It's a series of steps. And step 1 is to promote propaganda that dehumanizes and vilifies the group that you're trying to eliminate. And in my visit this summer, the thing I couldn't get out of my mind were the comments that President Trump had made during the campaign trail about many groups. They're not genocidal per se, but they are, textbook step one. And my question is, as a supporter of free speech, am I philosophically pigeonholed into supporting the precursors of genocide?
That's a good question. Do you want to?
Yes. But I think you said it yourself. Propaganda is not free speech. I mean, if you take the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, from 1933, when the Nazis came into power, there was not free speech in Germany. There was only the right to promote Nazi propaganda and no right to counter that speech. And the same in the Soviet Union. And that's why I'm puzzled when people want to criminalize speech or fight free speech on the ground that you risk promoting violence and mass murder and genocide. In every country where you had mass murder and genocide, there was no free speech. There was only the right to promote propaganda for one group targeting another, and that has nothing to do with free speech.
And to just put a little bit of a lawyeristic spin on what Flemming said, in the situation in Rwanda as well as in Nazi Germany, it's the government that is speaking, including through state-owned media channels. And I would absolutely, as the most ardent free speech defender, say government may not champion inequality, let alone dehumanization. I mean, the ACLU actually brought lawsuits saying that South Carolina should not be displaying the Confederate flag because that was conveying to so many people a message of subordination that was coming from the government. Combined, and there was actual incitement in Rwanda that would satisfy the very strict standard that the United States Supreme Court has set out. But you probably know that the state-owned media broadcasters were using the most ugly terms, was it cockroaches, right, to go out and kill the cockroaches, and were actually not only inciting imminent violence, but participating in it by telling, one of the tribes where the others were hiding. They're hiding in that church, go get them. So the government it was not just speech, it was speech, as Justice Douglas said, brigaded with action. It was like criminal solicitation.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that. I think that's a good answer. Both answers were very good.
Hey, my name's Ben. I'm from the business school. Thanks for being here. In 2012, a trailer for an anti-Islamic video called "The Innocence of Muslims" allegedly incited global riots, and then the attack on our consulate in Benghazi, where 4 Americans were killed. 2 weeks later, the writer and producer of that video was arrested in Los Angeles, and then he was charged and put in jail for probation violations, which included using an alias and using the internet. And this, to me, reeks of criminalization of speech that the government disagreed with. And I'm curious both of your opinions on this case, or if you have any more insight.
I'm not familiar with the facts or I've forgotten them, but I recently reread President Obama gave a really fantastic defense of free speech right after this incident. He spoke at the United Nations General Assembly and talked about how we could not punish that film, but I wasn't aware that maybe somehow that was done in effect.
Do you have?
I remember the case, but I don't remember the details. But I do remember the details of a similar case. There was a pastor in Florida who some years ago said that he wanted to burn the Quran on the anniversary of 9/11. And he had a segregation of 50 people. And nevertheless, all US media provided him a microphone to broadcast, these views. And I think I mean, he should have a right to say whatever he wants, but I think the media also have responsibility to, I mean, how many people does this individual represent? How important is what he's doing in his own backyard with 50 people? And I think this is about globalization as well. But what I found very problematic in that case was that Secretary Robert Gates and also and several people called up this pastor and asked him not to proceed, even though what he intended to do was within his constitutional rights. And I can understand for practical matters that you want to avoid Americans being attacked abroad, but you should be very conscious that what you actually do as a government is that you call on a citizen to refrain from exercising the rights that is protected by the Constitution, and nobody paid attention to that fact. And I think it's a slippery slope all over the world. We see the same in Europe, where you have ministers, prime ministers calling on individuals not to exercise their rights because what kind of reaction you may be confronted with in other parts of the world.
And if I could just add a word on the Benghazi situation, what I do remember was that the film was blamed for the attack on our embassy, right? I know that that's factually disputed, but Obama said even if that is the case, that is a reason, that would be a special reason not to punish the speech, right? Because then you're just going to encourage other terrorists, right? They got what they wanted, which was to censor the speech. So if you give in, it's like paying a ransom. And I thought he took exactly the right line there.
I don't remember him being as good as you
Yeah.
remember him, but I will say.
I just reread it
I will say,
yesterday. I'll send it to you.
I agree with your point that I think that was ultimately, it was
He was bad on
damning.
other speech issues,
It was
don't get me wrong.
It was damning speech. I don't think he ultimately went to jail for that reason, although it's questionable. But let me make this point. That's not incitement. It's not incitement to say something that, let's put it this way, pisses a lot of other people off, and then they go off and they commit violence. And shutting a person down like that is an instance of what's typically known as the heckler's veto. So you have to make a sharp
The
distinction.
assassin's veto.
Oh, and in this case, it's the assassin, which is a wonderful term for that. You have to make a distinction between people who are advocating the use of violence against specific other people in circumstances in which the use of violence is likely. So I want to kill you, let's all get together and attack Flemming, that kind of thing. That's more along the lines of incitement and just angering a lot of people who then make an independent decision to go off and commit violence. That's not only is that not incitement, it's free speech, and the government has a positive obligation to protect those people. But I think that was a really sorry episode in general. So it's a great question. Okay, over here.
I was interested in two thoughts that I think both of you agreed to, and want to extend it in a perhaps counterintuitive fashion to our current president. And that is to say, both of you, I think, suggest that, at least in the United States, it's not the governmental laws that are at issue, it's the social pressures. I think both of you agreed to that. And the other was that free speech threatens the established social order. And that's usually what's really triggering all these efforts at censorship and so forth. I'm just looking around in this room and realizing we're all 1%ers. We are the established order. I am a graduate of this school, albeit 30 years ago, and you're all law professors. Are we capable, as part of the established order, of determining what is or is not fake speech, false information? I wholeheartedly agree with you. The only real solution here is to think for yourself. But my question is there perhaps a silver lining here? Trump won largely on the grounds he didn't give a flying F word about political correctness.
Yeah.
And political correctness is, in this society today, a very powerful social pressure to keep your mouth shut. I don't like Trump, don't get me wrong, but I can see a silver lining there. I'd like to hear what each of you think about that.
I completely agree with what you say, and in some ways, I perversely saw a silver lining to the cloud of Trump not too long ago calling for deportation or imprisonment of flag burners, because I thought, yes, you know, on so many campuses and in so many elite institutions, people have had this sense that, you know, the power of censorship or suppression is going to be used against speech that I dislike. And so for them to see that, well, you know, maybe progressive speech could be subject to punishment if you let something that's offensive or seen to be possibly dangerous or disliked by officials, once they see that that's vulnerable, maybe they will understand this concept that we've been talking about, the indivisibility of free speech. If we want free speech for ideas we like, we have to guarantee it for ideas that we hate as well.
Yeah, I hope that we may be on the verge of the left, even though I would not use that word usually, but because it generalizes in a way that you maybe shouldn't. But the left has for many years been critical of free speech. And with Trump in the White House, the left may regain its willingness to defend free speech in this Trump era. And on the surface of it, populists in Europe and Trump, yes, they go against political correctness, and it looks as if they defend free speech. And maybe that's partly explains the popularity of Trump, that he's saying things that a lot of people feel that they haven't been allowed to say for a long time. But in fact, these populist figures, they are very anti-free speech, because they insist on talking on behalf of the people, and they define who belongs to the people and who do not belong. And those who do not belong, religious, ethnic minorities, they should not enjoy the same rights as everybody else. And that makes it urgent for people who usually think that we should limit freedom of speech in order to protect the weak, that in fact we need to defend freedom of speech in order to fight those who would like to clamp down on minorities.
Ms. Strossen, you said earlier that we all have one message that we consider to be uniquely dangerous. So I wanted to give you all one example of that and see if you could comment. Some of the same groups and individuals that champion free speech when it comes to the right to demonize Muslims and other marginalized groups, for many of those individuals, the one issue that they can't tolerate free speech on is criticism of Israel, defense of Palestinian human rights. There's been a spate of laws passed by state legislatures in this country targeting the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. There have also been universities. Just last week, Fordham University banned its Students for Justice in Palestine chapter, and there are many other examples of Palestinian human rights advocates being targeted on universities and by state legislatures. So I was just wondering if you all could comment on that.
Yeah. You won't be surprised that I oppose that form of censorship and viewpoint discrimination. I saw a study that was done by the Center for Constitutional Rights last year that said that it was the most common pattern of censorship on campus was supposedly anti-Zionist criticism of Israel. I don't know if that's factually true, but there certainly were, that it's the worst, but there certainly were many disturbing incidents. I know that the university and the ACLU all over the country has opposed these kinds of measures. There was an effort in the University of California system last year to equate anti-Zionism or speech critical of Israel with anti-Semitic speech. I completely disagree with that characterization, being a Jew myself and knowing many Israelis and many Jews who are highly critical of Israeli policy. But besides, I would defend the right to engage in anti-Semitic speech along with any other hate speech. So I agree with you.
Yeah, I think that is in fact the conceptual test, because it turns out that quite often people are in favor of free speech as long as it's free speech for people with whom they agree. If I should talk a little bit about my own situation, a lot of people who are critical of Islam and want to defend the right to demonize Muslims, as you say, they perceived me as their ally for quite some time until I started to defend the right of radical imams to talk out in favor of Sharia law as long as they do not incite violence. So I think if you want to be trustworthy, you have to be consistent and be willing to defend the speech that you don't like.
I should say that I talked about how the ACLU lost 15% of its members, disproportionately Jewish membership, and so many of the people who quit said, I draw the line at Nazi speech. The national executive director of the ACLU at the time, Aryeh Neher, was not only Jewish, but a Holocaust survivor who came to this country as a child. Most of his family was murdered by the Nazis. He was born in Berlin. And I'm the daughter of a Holocaust survivor as well. And I was thinking about that when you asked, how can we learn tolerance? And people have asked me, how is it possible for you as a Jew and the daughter of a Holocaust survivor? And the truth is, it isn't even hard, because I never see the client as being the particular person who happens to be speaking or the particular message. I always see it more abstractly as the freedom to speak. And Aryeh Neher wrote a wonderful book about this whole episode called Defending My Enemy, something like The Risks of Freedom, but as a subtitle. And he said the question that he was asked over and over again was, how can you, as a Holocaust survivor, as a Jew, how can you defend free speech for Nazis? And he made a point that both Flemming and I have made, that it is especially important for a group that is always going to be a minority, that is never going to wield political power. We, of all people and of members of all groups, are the ones that depend on neutral principles of civil liberties and human rights. And as Aryeh said, if free speech dies, then how are the Jews going to call out for protection when we need it? We can never call on the power of government. We have to depend on the power to oppose government through free speech.
We're over here.
Yeah. So this issue is a little bit more having to do with practicality and less with this sort of principle debate. And you actually may have some insight. I'm 19 years old. You guys are a little bit older. Some insight I'm about to talk about, and that is, that has to do with this, these alternative facts, to use a recent reference. And there used to be 3 channels, and everyone read the newspaper at dinner time, and it was this sort of not sensationalized presentation of the news, and that's just how it was. Now we have all these different outlets of information. It's very difficult for different news sources, whether they be newspapers or broadcast networks, to compete for people's attention, and that's just what they have to do. And as a result of that, you see news of all sorts becoming much more sensationalized. You see newspapers cutting staffs like crazy. If they don't disappear, their staffs are significantly reduced. Talk about a massive hit to investigative journalism, right? So this is a serious practical problem in this country. I personally don't think that getting our news, at least predominantly from a place like Twitter, is a good thing for our democratic society, and I'm sure you would probably, hopefully, agree with me, at least on a practical standpoint. So the question is, when you have, especially when you have an executive sort of, let's say, promoting things that are not true, what's the solution to creating a standard of truth that is, I think, very important in society? Because we're talking about free speech here. In order to have free speech, we need to, it's preventing the government from oppressing us, right? So in order to do that, in order to protect that, we need private organizations to sort of maintain a basic level of truth, so that free speech, especially by the government, doesn't oppress the society. So what's the fix to that? You know, how do you view that situation?
Yeah, that's a very good question. But maybe you don't know. But the New York Times, the first week after the election, gained 132,000 subscribers.
How many do you think they used to have?
And the same happened to the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. So there are people who take notice and they want reliable information. But to me, the deeper question, the deeper issue here is that we need to regain and reconquer the principles of the Enlightenment that many people have forgotten about. And the key to the success of our society, I believe, were based on two principles that Jonathan Rauch explains in a magnificent book called The Kindly Inquisitors. And those principles, they work in democracy, they work in a market economy, and they work in science. And there can be no final say. Everyone has a right to challenge whatever is being said, and there's never going to be an end to it. And the second principle is that there is no personal authority. I cannot say to you that because I'm the Pope, this and this is the case, or because I'm Ayatollah Khomeini, or in government, I am in possession of the truth. And those two principles have determined Western society's struggle to promote truth and reason, and that they are key to our success. And if you look around the world with, illiberal societies, dictatorships, and so on and so forth, they are far less effective than societies built on these principles of liberal science. But too many people have given up on those principles, and they don't believe in them. That is free speech and tolerance and things like that. And if you don't believe it, and if you've forgotten about it, it's very easy to cave into things like fake news and false information and conspiracy theories and things like that.
The positive side of the multiplicity of sources and information available on the internet is it's a treasure trove, and somehow we have to learn to evaluate. I don't like the word truth because it sounds too doctrinaire, but to look for plausible research, thorough research, credible sources, and so forth. And so I find this much easier to get more information and more details and more facts and more analysis by using, and you alluded to it yourself, private organizations. So if I want information about human rights issue, I would go to the website of Human Rights Watch. Somebody else might not think that they're credible and might go to Amnesty International or some other source. But and if it's an issue about internet, I would go to one of the questions that was asked earlier. I would go to the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and all of these organizations are doing reports. I mean, thoroughly documented reports. They have experts that volunteer who are knowledgeable in the pertinent fields, and it's a treasure trove of information. But we have to learn basic critical reading and analytical skills to never believe it just because it's in the New York Times or, heaven forbid, on the ACLU website. Even I would have a healthy degree of skepticism about everything, but you can look for indicia of plausibility and credibility.
Yeah, I think it's far easier to find out the truth on things today than it ever has been, and will continue to be that so long as people are free to proliferate more news sources and news outlets. You do have to spend time examining things. Consider the fact that it's far harder to trick masses of people when you have more outlets. It's certainly far harder for the government to control the source of information when you have a diverse array of news outlets than it ever was. So I kind of challenge the premise of your question, but I mean, ultimately your point is a good one. I just think that technology and competition are improving things rather than creating problems. Next one.
All right, so my question concerns what I think to be a concerning trend among some progressives in the United States, and that is if I were to criticize a particular moral principle in Christianity, most progressives would not have a problem with that. Similarly, if I questioned a metaphysical claim in the Book of Mormon, progressives would not take issue with that. Yet the moment I criticize an aspect of the doctrine of Islam, or question the authenticity of the Quran or anything along those lines, you're suddenly called an Islamophobe or a racist or a bigot. All these terms which are generally not applied to individuals who criticize these other faiths. So I'm sort of wondering, do you see this as problematic as well, and what do you attribute this trend to?
I see it as very problematic and very real, and I would take it a step further. Both in Europe and the United States, I've seen instances where people who are expressing sincerely held Christian beliefs that homosexuality is a sin, for example, are accused of engaging in hate speech. So it's not only is it not respected as protected speech, but it's denounced as hate speech, which is kind of ironic because you could say, well, isn't that hate speech on the basis of religion? And now you know me well enough to know that I would defend the freedom to say all of the above, but I do think we have to be aware of this double standard. And the reason I think, you ask, why is this so? I think because of this notion, which I totally reject, but that we should somehow be more sensitive about criticizing those who have the least power and are the most marginalized. But actually, I think in many sectors, powerful sectors of this society, fundamentalist evangelical Christians really lack a lot of power. So even if we were to accept that standard, which I do not, as a factual matter, I think it might apply to a lot of Christian expression in a lot of places.
Yeah, I have some practical experience with what you're talking about. Yeah, and I mean, you know, I didn't know anything about Islam 11 years ago, but I've had a crash course over the past 11 years. Now I know a little bit more because I wanted to understand what was going on. And I think there are some differences between Islam and Christianity that makes it more difficult for Muslims themselves to challenge the canonical texts and for outsiders to criticize or ridicule whatever you want. And one thing is that the Quran is being perceived as the direct word of God that was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, while the Bible or Christians believe that the Bible was written by human beings. And if it's written by human beings, then it can be subject to interpretation, while there is far less room for interpretation when it comes to the Quran, because it is the word of God and you're not allowed to challenge that. Another thing is that the Prophet Muhammad, according to Muslims, is infallible. Everything that Muhammad said and did is the truth, and it's infallible. And therefore, if you publish cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, or if you ridicule him, then you commit blasphemy or apostasy, and it is okay to kill you. And the third challenge, I believe, for Muslims in order to work out a doctrine that is compatible with liberal democracy is this lack of a clear division between politics and religion. Islamists today, they want to recreate the caliphate at the times of Muhammad, or the four caliphs that lived right after Muhammad, and that is seen as the ideal society for the Islamic State, for Al-Qaeda, for the Muslim Brotherhood, and other radical groups, even no matter whether they're in favor of committing violence or not. And unfortunately, they stand on solid theological ground. And therefore, people who say that the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda has nothing to do with Islam, we're fooling ourselves. And that's why it's very difficult to challenge these groups on theological grounds, because they quote the Quran. And I think, we need to support and call for Islamic experts and scholars and imams to really work out a religious doctrine based on the texts that is compatible with liberal democracy and secular principles. And to me, that is really the greatest challenge. And we do not achieve anything by avoiding the problem, even though it may makes us feel uncomfortable, and we risk being labeled racist and Islamophobes, which, by the way, is a very stupid word, because it indicates that you suffer from a disease if you criticize Islam. So you just take a pillow, lay on the couch, and you'll be treated.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is I think a large part of the problem is the ideas generally described as multiculturalism, and the 2 points that I'll make about that is, one, it's a view that holds that groups take precedence over individuals, that we all have to be looked at through the lens of a group, and secondly, that it's somehow improper to criticize other people's cultures or religions, which is really wrong in my view. These are, a culture and a religion are both bodies of ideas. They're ultimately founded on ideas. They're every bit as criticizable and should be evaluated just like any other body of ideas. Okay, let's move over here. Can we make this the last one?
Maybe we should.
Okay, last question.
If they have questions, we could answer all the questions in one, so nobody will be refused.
Well, why don't the two remaining people who are there just tell us your questions, and then we'll give the quickest answer to them we can.
Okay. So the psychologist Jordan Peterson came under fire when he criticized gender pronoun laws in Canada, and he argued that a lot of extremism is argued through one's own psychology, where they fall in the 5 factors test. So in our culture, how do you combat a culture that is psychoepistemologically less concerned with facts, reality, the primacy of reality over consciousness, and more concerned with emotions, feelings, and just sort of subjective interpretations of reality?
Okay, and what's yours? Just one final.
My question was, I was just wondering if you could share your thoughts on whether spending money to influence elections should be a form of free speech, whether individuals as well as corporations and large organizations deserve that right, and whether campaign finance regulations are an infringement of free speech, as has been held in some Supreme Court cases like Buckley versus Vallejo, or cases against the Federal Election Commission. So I was wondering your thoughts about that.
Why don't I just give my one-word answer? Yes, it's free speech,
Yes.
and no, it shouldn't be prevented. And I've written a lot on this, and you can look at it. And I'd be happy to talk with you afterwards. But I think that's part of what I was referring to earlier when I criticized Hillary Clinton. I don't think she's good on this issue. But if others
And I agree with you, and I'll also be painfully brief, which is, since you mentioned Buckley versus Vallejo, it was an ACLU case. Read the ACLU brief. We argued, I think, very persuasively, and it's a point I still adhere to, that although regulation and reform sound so positive, the devil is in the details. And if you really want to bring about reform, of opening up the process to minor parties, to third-party candidates, to having everybody have an equal opportunity to have a voice as a candidate and as a supporter, that these laws are achieving exactly the opposite. They've basically functioned as incumbent protection acts.
Yeah, well, I'll give a shot at your question then. I think you're absolutely right. I would recommend a book, in fact, that was published back in 2006 by a French expert in international relations. His name is Dominique Moïse, and the book's title is Geopolitics of Emotions. Social media and also cultural factors empower emotions as arguments in a debate, and quite often, if you don't have to put forward arguments if you are able to express your emotions in a very strong way. You can win the debate. And if you are being countered by other arguments, you can just say, well, that's what I feel. You cannot deny that I have those emotions. So, and we don't want, of course, to undermine people's emotions and take away their emotions. And quite too often, that becomes a very powerful argument. And social media, again, is reinforcing this trend. You have these bubbles and shitstorms. It's all about expressing anger or support, strong emotions, instead of putting forward good arguments based on reason and analysis and so on and so forth. So unfortunately, we are living in a time when the expression of strong emotions tend to win the day and not necessarily good arguments, at least on social media and the internet, but hopefully not in an institution like this.
All right, we have to wrap it up. Thanks to my panelists, to all the sponsors, and all of you.
Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. What?
Can you get one more?
Oh, you have a question? Brent, that's entirely your shoot. I think we're...
Shoot, you have 20 seconds for your question.
All right, so my name is Gordon Hamill. I'm the president and founder of American Voice for Freedom. I'm one of the groups that was targeted by the Obama administration for our views on spending, taxes, government waste, fraud, and abuse. I was also targeted with a surprise audit by the IRS personally as well. So my question is this a common thing? Has this happened before? I mean, I've never been the president of a nonprofit prior to 2 years ago. Are you guys aware of any type of situation where the United States government was actively crushing free speech using the IRS nonprofit division?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's been a long history of it. I certainly, in my own lifetime, remember the Nixon administration did that against its political enemies, and it's very scary to have the levers of government be able to use discretionary power in an ideologically discriminatory way.
I can recommend Matt Kippy wrote a book in 2014. The title is Don't Hurt People and Don't Take Their Stuff. There is a chapter there about the way IRS all through US history has been applied to silence criticism.
Kim Strassen's The Intimidation Game is also a terrific book on the subject. All right.
Most of the
You're in
stuff,
good company. I don't know, that's a consolation.
most of the stuff we publish on the website is like Inspector General reports, GAO reports. It's all good stuff. There's no really opinion.
All right. Thanks.
Okay, thank you all for coming. Thank you so much to our panelists for being here and for the co-sponsors. Tomorrow at noon, we have Josh Blackman discussing the fate of Obamacare in the Trump administration, so that'll be fun. Patai will be served. And then just to throw this out there, if you guys are afraid of executive power and a powerful centralized president exercising and infringing on your rights, the Federalist Society is here for you. You just have to agree that in the next administration, you won't bring those powers back. Thank you guys. Thank you.